Stalingrad, December 1942. The wind cut like a blade through the shattered skeleton of the city. Snow drifted between twisted metal and scorched concrete, silent, except for the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere beyond the rubble, a single rifle cracked. A German soldier dropped instantly, a small red bloom staining the snow around his collar. No one saw where it came from. No one ever did. The ruins were alive with ghosts, unseen Soviet marksmen who watched through shattered windows and burned out tanks. But among them, one name passed in whispers, a name the Germans began to fear more than the sound of incoming shells. Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev. His rifle never trembled. His patience was inhuman. In the frozen hell of Stalingrad, he developed a tactic so precise, so unpredictable, that even Germany's best sharpshooters could not comprehend how they were being hunted. A single man, with a single rifle, would change the psychology of modern warfare. And this is the story of how one sergeant's impossible tactic left German snipers shaking with fear. By the summer of 1942, Hitler believed victory in the East was within reach. The Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory, seizing the rich lands of Ukraine, the Donbass, and parts of the Caucasus. Every village burned behind them. Every road led east toward one last obstacle that glittered beside the Volga River, Stalingrad. A city that bore Stalin's name was more than a strategic objective, it was a symbol. To Hitler, capturing it would humiliate his greatest enemy. To Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. The order was absolute, not one step back. By August 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had reached the outskirts. Luftwaffe bombers pounded the city for days, turning factories, apartment blocks, and tram lines into a wasteland of brick dust and ash. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the opening week. Those who survived often fought alongside soldiers armed with little more than grenades and desperation. When German troops entered, they found no city in the traditional sense. It was a graveyard made of concrete, where every wall concealed a rifle barrel and every cellar hid a squad of Soviet defenders. Urban warfare was unlike anything the Germans had faced before. Their tanks were useless in the narrow ruins. Machine gunners fired blind through clouds of plaster dust, and from the shadows unseen, patient, the Soviet snipers began their quiet work. For the Soviets, the Volga River was both lifeline and trap. Supplies crossed it under constant shell fire, ferried by small boats through smoke and debris. The Red Army clung to the city's western bank, refusing to yield. Men were ordered to fight even when unarmed, expected to pick up rifles from the dead. One Soviet political officer famously declared, "There is no land beyond the Volga." By October, the front lines had dissolved into fragments. Street by street, floor by floor, the struggle became personal. A war fought with knives, grenades, and whispers. German commanders called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Snipers were kings in this chaos. A man with a rifle could hold an entire square. He needed no army, just nerves of steel, a good vantage point, and endless patience. The Soviets, recognizing this, began training and deploying more marksmen than any army before them. From factory workers to hunters, men and women learned to shoot, hide, and wait. They became the unseen heartbeat of the defense assassins of opportunity who dismantled German morale shot by shot. And it was here, among the smoking ruins of Stalingrad, that one hunter from the Ural Mountains arrived with a skill the Red Army desperately needed. His name was Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev, a shepherd's son, raised on precision and silence. He had grown up stalking deer in the Siberian snow, learning how to move unseen and strike once, never twice. Now those same instincts would turn him into a weapon of war. By the time he took position near the shattered factories of the Stalingrad front, Soviet morale was collapsing. The Germans held most of the city's high ground. Their snipers, trained, equipped, and confident, picked off Soviet soldiers who dared to lift their heads. The Red Army needed more than courage. It needed fear to change sides. That transformation would begin with Zaitsev's arrival. He came not as a symbol, but as a soldier with one mission: to kill the men who thought themselves invisible. To hunt the hunters. To show that patience and cunning could outmatch optics and prestige. And in the endless gray of Stalingrad's winter, his name would become a whisper of dread in the German ranks. Because by early November, one man's rifle had begun to tilt the psychological balance of an entire army. By late 1942, the Soviet High Command had begun to understand that the rifle could be as powerful as artillery when placed in the right hands. In the rubble of Stalingrad, sniper warfare evolved from an individual skill into a strategic instrument. It was war stripped to its purest form. One bullet, one heartbeat, one life ended in silence. The Germans had dominated open-field battles across Europe with tanks and blitzkrieg tactics. But inside the ruins, that momentum dissolved. Every alley became a trap, every window a potential grave. And as the fighting tightened into hand-to-hand savagery, the unseen presence of a sniper could paralyze an entire company. Men refused to move. They ducked behind walls and hesitated before crossing open ground, not because of artillery, but because of the idea that a single, unseen rifleman might be watching. The Soviets weaponized this fear. They created sniper schools right behind the front lines, teaching patience, camouflage, and marksmanship under fire. But few embodied the art more completely than Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev. A young sailor from the Pacific Fleet transferred to Stalingrad's 62nd Army. Zaitsev's upbringing had trained him for this war long before it began. Born in Yeleninskoye in 1915, he spent his childhood herding livestock across the icy ridges of the Urals. There, survival demanded silence. He learned to judge distance by instinct, to read the wind through the motion of leaves, and to remain perfectly still until the moment was right. His grandfather had taught him a simple creed: one shot, one kill. When war came, that creed became his doctrine. At Stalingrad, Zaitsev's first confirmed kills came within days. He didn't just shoot, he studied. He watched the Germans' movements, their routines, their comfort zones. He began setting decoy positions, letting the enemy reveal themselves before firing. His kills were not random. Each one was designed to send a message. Nowhere was safe. He preferred the Mosin Nagant M9130 rifle, standard issue for Soviet snipers, fitted with the PU 3.5x scope, a simple, durable weapon, less refined than the German Mauser 98K with its Zeiss optics, but deadly in the right hands. Zaitsev often removed the scope altogether, relying on iron sights when shooting through debris or heavy dust. He believed the glass reflection could betray his position. To him, invisibility was more valuable than technology. His reputation spread quickly. By mid-November, Zaitsev had killed over 100 German soldiers, including officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. But it wasn't just his accuracy that alarmed the enemy. It was his ability to vanish. He used the shattered architecture of the city as camouflage, crawling through pipes, hiding beneath staircases, even blending with corpses to lure the overconfident. To the Germans, he was a phantom. To Soviet soldiers, he was proof that the impossible could be done. The Soviet command recognized this psychological edge. They began using Zaitsev not only as a killer but as a teacher. He trained dozens of new snipers, forming what became known as the sniper movement. His trainees would go on to kill thousands of German troops collectively. It was warfare multiplied, a silent contagion spreading through the Red Army. Each sniper was more than a soldier. They were symbols of defiance. Their bullets were acts of vengeance for the burned villages, the murdered families, the endless retreat of 1941. They made the Germans feel what the Soviets had felt: helplessness in the face of something unseen. By December, the city had become a living organism of death and watchfulness. Every ruin concealed eyes. Every pause might mean a rifle was aimed at you. The Germans, once so sure of their superiority, began to hesitate. Reports from captured soldiers spoke of fear, a personal fear of being watched, of being marked by an unseen hand. And in the heart of that psychological battlefield stood Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev, transforming individual marksmanship into a doctrine of terror and precision. His name spread across the front lines, passed from trench to trench, whispered among German patrols. A single man had reshaped the nature of combat in Stalingrad. But the German high command would not allow that humiliation to last. Somewhere across the river, they began to prepare their response, one that would bring Zaitsev face to face with his most dangerous opponent. The human angle fear in the rubble Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a labyrinth of ghosts, smoke, ash, and the constant echo of small arms fire bouncing off concrete. For the men inside it, survival meant becoming less than human. It meant not moving when instinct screamed to run, not blinking when dust burned the eyes, not breathing too loud. The sniper's war was invisible. To the ordinary soldier, it felt like a curse. You could fight an enemy you could see charge a position, throw a grenade, scream and fire back. But a sniper? He was an absence of mind somewhere in the ruins, studying you through a circle of glass. One movement, one mistake, and you were gone. German infantry learned this quickly. They entered the city with swagger, confident in their superior training and weapons. But after a few days, they moved differently. They crouched lower. They stopped lighting cigarettes. They learned to speak in whispers and crawl beneath the windowsills. A single crack of a Soviet rifle could freeze a whole platoon in place. That was the environment Zaitsev created. He turned fear into strategy. He knew that killing one man could frighten a dozen, but killing an officer could paralyze 100. His targets were chosen with purpose: machine gunners, radio operators, engineers repairing tanks. Every bullet disrupted a system. Every death sent ripples of panic through the enemy chain of command. Zaitsev later wrote, "For us, every German who set foot in Stalingrad was already dead. He just didn't know it yet." It wasn't arrogance, it was psychological warfare, pure and silent. For his comrades, Zaitsev's presence was something different. In a world where death was random, he brought a sense of control. He gave the soldiers hope that precision and patience could still matter. Men fought harder when they knew Zaitsev was somewhere nearby watching over them. They said his rifle spoke for all of them, revenge for the burned villages of the motherland. But even for Zaitsev, the toll was immense. Each kill left its mark. In the rare quiet moments, he wrote brief notes to himself, names, distances, conditions, but never emotions. To stay alive, he had to think like prey and predator at once. In Stalingrad, that balance was the difference between heroism and madness. The tactical angle. The triad and the art of the invisible. Zaitsev's genius was not only in marksmanship, but in method. He understood that the sniper's greatest weapon was time, how long he could wait unseen before taking the perfect shot. But he also knew no man could remain invisible forever. So he built a system designed to multiply his reach without revealing his position. It became known as the sniper's triad. Each triad consisted of 3 soldiers, 1 shooter, 1 spotter, and 1 scout or decoy. The scout observed the enemy's movement and drew attention. The spotter located targets and calculated distance and wind. The shooter, often Zaitsev himself, remained hidden, silent, invisible until the moment came. The beauty of the system was deception. If a German soldier saw movement, he would fire back, revealing his own position. But by then, the real sniper, several meters away, would already have him in his sights. The Germans called it the ghost method. They could not understand how the Soviets fired from multiple angles with such precision. What they didn't realize was that Zaitsev's triads rotated constantly. No one stayed in one place for long. They used mirror fragments to check for enemy reflections, piles of rubble as nests and frozen corpses as cover. To the Germans, it seemed supernatural, impossible to predict. Zaitsev's camouflage discipline bordered on obsession. He used soot and grease to darken his skin, blending into the shadows. He covered his rifle barrel with cloth to prevent glare. When snow came, he switched to white uniforms, even painting his weapon to match the terrain. He often said that the first enemy a sniper must defeat is light. Each day he adapted. Sometimes he fired from inside destroyed pipes, other times from beneath wrecked vehicles. He watched how the sun moved, how the shadows lengthened, how the snow melted around footprints. He thought not as a soldier, but as a hunter in the wilderness. His kills became a kind of language. Each one taught the Germans a new kind of fear. Every missed shot taught him something too about angles, ricochets, patience. He once waited 3 full days for a single shot. 3 days without food, water, or sleep, and when he finally fired, it was a perfect kill. To him, it was worth it. Because the point was not the number of enemies killed, but the effect each kill created. By midwinter, Zaitsev's tactics had spread across the front. Dozens of sniper triads now hunted in the ruins. The city became a vast chessboard of invisible duels, Soviet and German marksmen trying to outweight, outthink, and outshoot each other. The Germans began sending their best sharpshooters from across the front to counter him. And among them, one name stood out, a man whose reputation matched Zaitsev's own. An elite sniper from Berlin, rumored to be an instructor at the Wehrmacht sniper school. His mission: eliminate the hunter of Stalingrad. A duel was coming. Not just between 2 men, but between 2 doctrines: technology versus instinct, precision versus patience, pride versus survival. And in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, That duel would become legend. The technological angle optics, steel, and simplicity on the surface. The Germans held the advantage in almost every category of technology. Their Karabiner 98K Mauser rifles, fitted with Zeiss Zielvier scopes, were masterpieces of precision engineering. Each scope was hand-calibrated, its reticle fine enough to pick out a helmet crest at 800 meters. Their uniforms were tailored for concealment, their field manuals refined from years of experience in Europe's campaigns. The German sniper was a product of science, a marksman built from mathematics, optics, and doctrine. The Soviets, by contrast, had almost noething elegant about their tools. The Mosin Nagant 9130, heavy and rough-edged, was a design from the 19th century. Its PU scope, with its simple crosshairs and narrow field of view, was crude compared to the German equivalent. And yet in Stalingrad that simplicity became an advantage. Zaitsev trusted his weapon not because it was perfect, but because it was reliable. He knew its imperfections intimately: the trigger pull, the barrel's drift when cold, the way the stock swelled in moisture. Where German snipers depended on technical precision, Soviet marksmen relied on adaptability. They adjusted instinctively for wind and distance. They measured by the human eye, not by calculation. Zaitsev's philosophy was brutally pragmatic. The rifle is a living thing. Learn its character, and it will speak for you. While the Germans searched for him using rangefinders and optics, he used reflection and shadow. He would watch for the faint glint of sunlight off a scope, or the nervous flicker of movement in a window. Once he saw that shimmer, the smallest flash of light, he knew where death would travel next. It was a war not of weapons, but of minds. And in that contest, simplicity often defeated sophistication. The enemy angle. The hunter from Berlin. By mid-December 1942, the Germans realized they faced more than an ordinary marksman. Reports of Zaitsev's kills circulated across the front, over 200 confirmed kills, many of them officers. To the Sixth Army, this was no longer a morale issue. It was a direct threat to command control within the ruins, so they decided to send their best. German records from that period mention an SS or Wehrmacht sniper instructor, possibly from the elite Scharfschützenschule in Sossen or Berlin. The man's name, Major Erwin König, has long been debated by historians. Soviet sources insist he was real, sent specifically to hunt Zaitsev. German archives offer no direct confirmation, but among the soldiers of Stalingrad, his existence was taken as fact. A ghost sent to kill a ghost. When rumors spread that a German super sniper had entered the city, Soviet morale trembled, but Zaitsev's did not. He saw it as an opportunity to prove that the sniper's war was not about rank or equipment, but about patience and intellect. The duel began without ceremony. Days of silence. Both men searching for each other's position in a wasteland of identical ruins. Each knew that the first to fire would likely die. It was the purest form of combat, two predators circling in absolute stillness. German accounts describe the fear that gripped snipers across the front as word of the duel spread. Even if König was a myth, the idea of him served a purpose: to rally German pride, to prove that their own could stand against the Red Army's legend. But Zaitsev had no need for myth. For him, the duel was practical, necessary, inevitable. One man had come to end his work, and Zaitsev had no intention of stopping. What began as rumor would soon become one of the most famous sniper engagements in history, one that blurred the line between documentation and legend. In the frozen corridors of Stalingrad, death was not loud. It was quiet, a faint metallic click, a whisper of powder, and then stillness. That silence was what haunted men most. For the Germans, it became unbearable. They had come from open fields and fast-moving campaigns, from wars of noise and motion. In Stalingrad, everything slowed. Every corner, every shadow could hide a rifle barrel. Officers stopped wearing insignia to avoid being singled out. Soldiers crawled instead of walking, waited instead of advancing. The pace of the war changed, dictated not by artillery but by the presence of invisible eyes. A German field report dated December 12, 1942 noted, "Our men are hesitant to occupy upper floors. They fear being seen. Snipers dominate the ruins." That fear was corrosive. It made strong soldiers uncertain, methodical units sluggish. The Wehrmacht's aggression, its greatest strength, was paralyzed by hesitation. For the Soviets, the effect was reversed. Each sniper's success became a story retold in trenches, printed in newspapers, broadcast through loudspeakers. Zaitsev's kills became national victories. His precision was described as vengeance from the motherland itself. It was propaganda, yes, but also something deeper. A reminder that even in hell, the individual could matter. Zaitsev's face appeared in Pravda, the Soviet newspaper. His words were quoted to inspire others. The enemy fears us because we see him before he sees us. Young soldiers began to imitate his patience, his stillness. Sniper schools expanded. The Red Army turned a man into a movement. But for the men who lived through it, both Soviet and German, the psychological strain was nearly identical. Snipers were feared but also isolated. They lived in silence, alone, in holes carved from rubble. They slept beside corpses for warmth, ate snow for water, and waited for hours without moving. Even victory was hollow, each shot a confirmation of how far one had drifted from ordinary humanity. Zaitsev understood this more than most. He once admitted to a comrade quietly, "When the war ends, I will have to learn how to stop watching." The sniper's art, at its heart, was not about killing. It was about patience, control, and psychology, the mastery of one's own fear while magnifying the enemy's. That mastery would soon be tested in its purest form, because as January 1943 approached, the duel everyone whispered about, the confrontation between Zaitsev and the mysterious German sniper, was about to unfold. And it would determine far more than just two men's fates. It would define the mythology of sniper warfare for generations. Stalingrad, January 1943. The snow had thickened into armor. The city was frozen in a white stillness broken only by the crack of distant rifles and the low hum of aircraft circling overhead. Zaitsev crouched behind a collapsed wall near the Lazur chemical factory, his Mosin Nagant resting on a sandbag blackened by soot. The rumors were true. A German elite sniper had entered the district hunting him. The Soviets called their adversary Major Koenig, though even then, the name carried uncertainty. All they knew was that German fire had become different, faster, colder, precise in a way that mirrored Zaitsev's own. His comrades began to die without warning, one by one, shot cleanly through the eye or throat. It was not random. Someone was studying them. Zaitsev and his spotter, Nikolai Kulikov, began their own hunt. The ruins between the factory and the railway embankment became their battlefield. It was a landscape of twisted rebar and shattered glass, a sniper's maze. Visibility was low, wind unpredictable, sound distorted by the echoing shells of hollow buildings. It was in every sense perfect for two hunters who depended on silence. For 3 days, the duel remained invisible. No direct sighting, only the evidence of presence, a flash of light on metal, a puff of dust where a bullet struck too close. Each man probing, testing, learning the other's patience. Zaitsev began his analysis the way a predator studies scent. He observed the angles of bullet strikes on nearby debris. He noted that the German preferred the late afternoon sun, using the glare to conceal his shots. He saw the pattern in where Soviet scouts were hit. Always from the same arc of approach, always near the same rubble ridge. He drew his map.
3 possible nests.
One was inside the shell of a burned-out tractor works. Another among the collapsed girders of a water tower. The third, more suspicious, was a wrecked machine gun position covered by a sheet of metal. Zaitsev stared at that spot for hours. Nothing, no movement, no reflection. Just silence, Kulikov whispered. "It's too quiet there." Zaitsev nodded. Quiet meant danger. They decided to test it. The next morning, Kulikov raised his helmet on a stick slowly, just enough to catch light. Seconds passed. Then a single shot. The helmet spun, a clean hole punched through it. The sound came from the direction of the metal sheet. Zaitsev's suspicion was confirmed. But he didn't fire back. Not yet. He knew the German expected retaliation, a quick reaction from an angry or fearful opponent. Instead, Zaitsev and Kulikov withdrew quietly, repositioning several meters to the left, where a destroyed truck lay half buried in the snow. They spent the next hours studying the reflections of the rising sun on that sheet of metal. Zaitsev's instinct told him something subtle. The shot had not come from behind the sheet itself, but beneath it. A cunning trick the German had created, a false decoy, firing from a narrow gap below to catch the Soviets off guard. Zaitsev understood instantly. This was no ordinary marksman. This was a mirror image of himself. The next day, both men returned to their positions before dawn. The temperature had dropped below -20. The air was so cold that every breath felt like glass. For hours, nothing moved. Even the sound of war faded into background hum, a world reduced to wind and heartbeat. Zaitsev lay motionless, his eye pressed to the scope, watching the metal sheet. Kulikov lay beside him, barely breathing. Then, near midday, sunlight shifted, and for the briefest moment, Zaitsev saw it. A glint, faint, almost imperceptible, reflected from beneath the metal. It was enough, he whispered. I see him. Kulikov slowly lifted his rifle, moving as if to prepare a shot, a deliberate feint. The German took the bait. A crack echoed, and the bullet whistled past, embedding into the truck's frame. The flash confirmed the position. Zaitsev adjusted his scope by instinct, no rangefinder, no measurement. He exhaled. One calm breath. One steady pull of the trigger. The shot struck exactly where the reflection had been. Silence. Then, a small motion, the faint, collapsing slump of a figure behind the metal. Zaitsev waited. Minutes passed. No return fire. Kulikov moved forward cautiously, rifle ready. When he reached the enemy's position, he found a body face down, still holding a German Mauser with a Zeiss scope. The rifle's barrel protruded through a small gap cut in the sheet's base, exactly as Zaitsev had deduced. Beside the body lay a steel identification tag, half buried in snow. The name was partially legible. Koenig, or perhaps Koenig, the letters blurred, the story uncertain. When Kulikov returned, he simply said, "It's done." Zaitsev nodded once. No triumph, no words. Just relief and exhaustion. The duel had lasted over 3 days. It was not cinematic, not glorious, just patience, calculation, and death. A battle between two minds who never truly saw each other. And yet that moment, that quiet shot in the ruins, became one of the most retold events of the entire war. Some would later doubt whether Koenig ever existed, but the fear, the legend, and the morale it shaped were real. Zaitsev's victory was more than a single kill. It symbolized the turning tide of the Eastern Front, the proof that the Wehrmacht's psychological dominance could be broken, that the hunter could become the hunted. But Stalingrad's story was not over. The city itself was collapsing, and the German army trapped within it was about to face the deadliest winter of their existence. And for Zaitsev, the duel's end was only the beginning of his next challenge, surviving the siege that would consume both armies. The duel between Zaitsev and Koenig, whether wholly factual or partly myth, became a weapon of morale. Within days, Soviet frontline papers printed the story. Our sniper has defeated the German master. It traveled from trench to trench, whispered in frozen dugouts, repeated by exhausted men who had not seen sunlight in weeks. It gave the soldiers something they had not felt in months: belief. The Germans heard it too. And in the whispering dark, it did something dangerous. It made them doubt. By late January 1943, the situation inside Stalingrad had become a nightmare. What had begun as a grand offensive under Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had turned into a tomb. The Sixth Army, once 330,000 strong, was starving, freezing, surrounded by the Soviet pincers of Operation Uranus. German lines had shrunk to a patchwork of ruins stretching barely a few kilometers. Food had run out. Ammunition was rationed to 5 rounds per man. Men boiled wallpaper for its paste, scraped frost for water, burned furniture for heat. Every shot mattered, and every sniper kill carried the weight of a battle. Zaitsev, now a legend among his comrades, continued to fight. Despite frostbite and a shattered scope lens, he refused to withdraw from the front. He taught new marksmen daily, often crawling out under cover of darkness to mark positions for them. The Soviet command recognized his tactical value. Zaitsev was no longer just a soldier. He was a symbol proof that the Red Army could fight toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht's best. Each morning, German sharpshooters attempted counterfire, but their precision had faded. The frost jammed their rifles, hunger dulled their vision, and their nerves, once steady, began to tremble. The hunters had become prey. In one report, a captured German sniper told interrogators, "We stopped using periscopes. Every glint, every mistake meant death. The Russians no longer feared us, we feared them." The transformation was psychological, but its effects were strategic. As German units lost confidence, their defensive coordination collapsed. The Soviets, sensing weakness, pushed harder. By late January, Soviet troops under General Chuikov's 62nd Army began slicing through final German strongholds, the Kessel, or Cauldron as German survivors called it. The once proud divisions 14th Panzer, 100th Jaeger, 71st Infantry were shadows. The Luftwaffe's air bridge had failed. Fuel was gone. Aircraft froze on the tarmac in the blizzards over Potomnik and Gumrak airfields. Inside the ruins of the Univermag department store, Paulus made his final stand. The German command center, buried beneath the wrecked building, was a frozen bunker of typewriters and silence. By January 30th, his headquarters received Hitler's last radio message. Surrender is forbidden. Hold your positions to the last man. Outside, Soviet snipers watched the building carefully, not for glory, but for any sign of resistance. Among them was Zaitsev's team, operating from a building just a few hundred meters away. They recorded no shots fired. The city had gone eerily quiet. The silence of men who no longer had the strength to fight. At dawn on January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered. He became the first German field marshal ever captured alive. When Soviet officers entered his bunker, he stood motionless, unshaven, exhausted, staring at the map table where his army had died on paper long before it did in the snow. For the men on the front, news of the surrender spread faster than any order. Soviet soldiers cried openly. Some hugged strangers. Others just stared into the frozen distance. Zaitsev, recovering from an eye wound sustained days earlier, was informed by his comrades in a makeshift hospital. He reportedly nodded and said quietly, "Stalingrad has answered." Outside, the city was unrecognizable. Entire districts had vanished under piles of bricks. Smoke still drifted from craters, mingling with snow like ghostly breath. Tens of thousands of German bodies lay half buried under ice, their gray uniforms blending into the white wasteland. Of the original 6th Army, fewer than 90,000 remained alive, and most of them would die in Soviet captivity within months. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was not just victory. It was resurrection. It marked the first time the Wehrmacht had been decisively and irreversibly crushed. From that day, the tide of war began to flow westward. Zaitsev, once just a shepherd from the Urals, had become one of its symbols, not for propaganda but for endurance, patience, and precision. And while his name became famous, Zaitsev himself remained silent about the details of his kills. When asked later about Koenig, he replied simply, "We never hunted men. We hunted fear." That line captured the essence of Stalingrad's climax, the transformation of a brutal, chaotic battle into a human story of resilience under impossible conditions. The snipers, both German and Soviet, fought unseen wars of nerves and calculation. But it was the moral strength behind the rifles, not the rifles themselves, that ultimately decided who survived the ruins. From that white silence of February 1943, the war changed. Germany's aura of invincibility was gone. The Red Army, hardened by fire and hunger, began to march west toward Kursk, toward Berlin, toward revenge. But for the men who had lived through Stalingrad, especially those like Zaitsev, victory came with a cost that could never be repaid. Every destroyed wall, every frozen comrade, every silent shot in the snow was a reminder of what war demanded. And as the smoke cleared over the ruins, the survivors began to realize something deeper, that even in victory, no one truly walked away untouched. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in ashes. From the Volga River to the shattered factories, not a single district escaped destruction. Every building carried the scars of bullets and the smell of smoke. When spring thaw came, the streets turned into rivers of melted snow and debris flowing over helmets, rifles, and bones. In that silence, the Soviet Union began counting the cost. More than 2 million men had fought in and around Stalingrad. Over 1 million were dead or wounded. The Red Army alone had lost 478,000 soldiers in the fight. But what remained could not be measured in numbers, it was the shift in spirit. Stalingrad had proven that the German machine could be broken. It was the moment when fear changed sides. Within weeks, Soviet command began to gather stories from the front, tales of courage, endurance, sacrifice. Among them, one name stood out in report after report: Vasily Zaitsev. His tally, officially recorded, exceeded 225 confirmed kills during the battle, including 11 enemy snipers. But it wasn't the number that mattered, it was how he fought. To the Red Army, Zaitsev embodied the doctrine of patience and intelligence. He didn't rely on raw aggression or luck. He waited, observed, and made every bullet count, a skill perfectly suited to a war where ammunition, time, and life itself were limited commodities. The Soviet propaganda machine quickly recognized the power of his story. News articles and radio broadcasts across the USSR described his duels and techniques in dramatic detail. They portrayed him as a calm, fearless man, a son of the mountains, methodical and humble, standing against the fascist invaders with nothing but skill and willpower. For a nation still reeling from loss, he became a symbol of survival through intellect. In early 1943, while still recovering from an eye injury caused by a mortar fragment, Zaitsev was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the country's highest honor. Marshal Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, personally decorated him and ordered the creation of an elite sniper training program based on Zaitsev's methods. The doctrine he taught was simple. Born from the rubble itself, study the field, count the seconds between shots, make the enemy fear what they cannot see. Dozens of his students, including the legendary Anatoly Chekhov and Nikolai Kulikov, would go on to train others, spreading Zaitsev's approach across the Eastern Front. It was tactical knowledge forged by desperation, now formalized into military science. But fame had a cost. The legend of Zaitsev began to take on a life of its own, larger than the man, reshaped by propaganda and myth. The duel with Major Koenig, once just a whispered battlefield rumor, grew into a symbol of the East-West confrontation, a morality tale of Soviet cunning versus German arrogance. Soviet newspapers and post-war films turned it into near mythology. The more the story spread, the less anyone could separate truth from embellishment. Even Zaitsev himself grew cautious of how his story was told. In later interviews, he rarely spoke of Koenig by name. He focused instead on the psychology of the battlefield, the patience, the waiting, the shared humanity of hunters in opposite ruins. He once said quietly, "The best shot is the one you never have to take." That humility set him apart. He didn't see himself as a hero, but as a survivor of something too vast to be glorified. Still, his methods continued to shape Soviet military doctrine long after the war. By 1944, sniper units had become a formalized and essential part of Red Army structure deployed in forests, cities, and open plains alike. Each of them carried not only a rifle, but also a psychological weapon: fear. The invisible presence of a sniper could freeze entire enemy platoons in place, delay movements, and break morale, and it was Zaitsev's blueprint they followed. By the end of 1943, the tide of war had fully reversed. Soviet forces were advancing westward, liberating Kiev, Smolensk, and Kharkov. Behind every victory, there was a generation of soldiers inspired by the same principle, born in the ruins of Stalingrad, that discipline and patience could overcome even the most powerful enemy. But as Zaitsev's legend rose, another side of the war began to surface: the immense emotional toll carried by those who survived it. Because beneath the medals, the victories, and the propaganda, every sniper carried ghosts, and for Vasily Zaitsev, those ghosts would follow him long after the snow of Stalingrad melted away. When the smoke of war finally lifted in 1945, the world looked nothing like the one Zaitsev had left behind. Cities across Europe were unrecognizable landscapes of ash and silence. For Zaitsev, the war ended not with celebration but with exhaustion. He had survived where so many had not. Yet survival, he would later admit, carried its own kind of burden. After Stalingrad, his injuries left him partially blind in one eye. A German shell fragment had nearly cost him both, but a skilled surgeon restored partial vision after multiple operations. When he returned to the front later in 1943, it was not as a sniper but as an instructor and logistics officer. The days of crawling through rubble were over, yet the discipline that had defined him remained unbroken. As the Red Army pushed westward into Germany, Zaitsev watched the transformation of the Soviet soldier. The terrified defenders of 1941 had become hardened veterans. They were no longer fighting for survival, they were fighting for justice, vengeance, and closure. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, it was the culmination of the same spirit that had begun in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. But the war's end brought little peace. Zaitsev returned to his hometown of Yeleninsk in the Ural Mountains, a quiet industrial settlement surrounded by forests. He took work as a factory director in Kiev, applying his discipline to the reconstruction effort. Colleagues remembered him as calm, precise, and humble, a man who spoke little of what he had done. When people asked about his record, he would smile faintly and change the subject. Inside, however, the memories never left. He kept a small wooden box containing his sniper's badge, his Hero of the Soviet Union medal, and a worn photograph of his comrades from Stalingrad. Many of the men in that photograph had died before the city was liberated. He would often sit in silence, staring at it not in pride but in remembrance. In the post-war years, Zaitsev's story became part of Soviet national memory. Schools taught his tactics as examples of patriotic excellence. Films, books, and newsreels turned his duels into epic tales. But for him, these retellings always felt distant, stylized versions of a reality too painful to romanticize. He knew what the battlefield smelled like, what fear sounded like when it was silent. No movie could recreate that. When interviewed in the 1960s, Zaitsev was asked what moment he remembered most vividly. He didn't speak of the duel with Koenig or of medals. Instead, he said quietly, "The moment after a shot when everything goes still, and you realize the world will never be the same." It was that stillness, that pause between life and death, that had defined his existence. He had lived through hundreds of those moments, each one leaving a mark deeper than any wound. By the time he retired, Zaitsev had become a respected war veteran, decorated but modest. He continued to support veterans associations and occasionally visited military academies to lecture young snipers. He emphasized patience, discipline, and restraint, principles he believed applied to life as much as combat. "War teaches you to wait," he once said, "but peace teaches you to remember." Vasily Grigorievich Zaitsev passed away in December 1991. At the age of 76, the very month the Soviet Union itself collapsed. It was a quiet death in a quiet world, far from the thunder of Stalingrad. Yet his story did not fade with him. In 2006, his remains were reburied in Volgograd, the modern name for Stalingrad, at Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that had once been the center of the fiercest fighting. His grave lies beneath a simple stone, engraved with his name, his rifle, and the words, "To Vasily Zaitsev, the hero of Stalingrad." On that hill, overlooking the Volga, stands the motherland calls the massive Soviet memorial statue, sword raised high above the city he defended. Every year, veterans and historians place flowers near his resting place. Some come not for the myth or the medals, but for the lesson his life carried. That courage is not the absence of fear, but mastery of it. For those who survived Stalingrad, the war never truly ended. It lived in their eyes, in the way they paused before loud noises, in the way they spoke of the dead. And in Zaitsev's story, that truth remains a reminder that history's greatest victories are written not only in triumph, but in endurance. The snow that once covered Stalingrad has long melted, but the silence of that battlefield and the discipline of the man who mastered it still echo through time. And as the world moved on, Zaitsev's name became more than legend. It became a question whispered in every war since. What kind of courage does it take to look through a scope, wait in the cold, and never flinch? History often remembers war through noise, through explosions, through speeches, through victory parades. But the truth of Stalingrad was found in silence, in the long waits between shots, in the breath held before the trigger, in the patience of men who refused to break. Vasily Zaitsev's legacy is not the number of enemies he killed. It is the discipline he proved possible. In a world collapsing under chaos, he became a symbol of control, a reminder that intellect, not brutality, wins survival. He turned a rifle into an instrument of thought, precision, and resolve. The duel that defined his legend may always remain partly shrouded in uncertainty. Perhaps there was no Major Koenig. Perhaps it was the myth a nation needed at its darkest hour. But even myths, when built upon truth, reveal something essential about those who believe them. Zaitsev's story became a mirror for the Soviet soul, a reflection of endurance under siege, and the quiet defiance of those who refused to yield. In the decades after the war, snipers from every nation studied his methods, not because they sought glory, but because they understood what he had mastered: the human mind, the patience to wait, the restraint to choose a single shot over many, the courage to face isolation without surrender. These are qualities not of a killer, but of a survivor. Today, the ruins of Stalingrad are rebuilt, The city renamed Volgograd. The Volga flows as it always did, carrying reflections of bridges and lights instead of smoke and flame. Yet beneath that calm surface lies memory, the echo of a rifleman's heartbeat. Steady, unbroken. Vasily Zaitsev's life reminds us that even in the most brutal corners of history, humanity endures not through rage but through resolve. That courage can exist without noise. That strength can live in stillness, and that sometimes the most powerful victories are those fought in silence, between breath, between heartbeats, between life and the cold patience of a man waiting in the snow.